Thanks for having me. I'm not going to be talking that much about honeybees because they're not probably my expert area, and I think you seem to have far more expertise from people like Annie and Philip here than you'll ever get from me. So I'll be talking mostly about all of the other wild bees and other insects that we have in the environment and how they interact with the marvelous flowers that we have in the world. So just a kind of quick thank you to all the people who I've worked with over the years. Science is never done by a single person in a vacuum. It's always teams of people, and it's huge numbers of funders who've supported various aspects of my work over the last decade and beyond. So I'm very grateful for that. And particularly, I'm really grateful for farmers who I've worked with in various parts of the world who have been incredibly generous with their time and their land, helping me to learn more about the world. So here we have something like an array of flowers. I think this is from South Africa, from Namaqualand. And we're going to think a little bit about what it's like to be an individual flower in that habitat. There's going to be far more individual flowers out there than probably there'll be pollinating insects. So each flower is having to compete with all those other flowers to get those insects to visit it and only it. And that's not easy. So it's a competition to be the brightest, the biggest, the most distinctive, the most exciting, the most attractive. And so it's a really quite intense market, if you like. And so flowers have evolved to have various adaptations in order to try and be more attractive and more exciting to pollinators. So they can be amazing colors, they can have amazing smells like this witch hazel. Love witch hazel in the late winter, early spring, when they've got that gorgeous scent on a kind of cold, clear day. And quite a lot of them have got interesting morphologies, so shapes that make them particularly suited for some pollinators more than others, and help to make sure that they have the most efficient pollination possible. So hopefully this talk will be mostly lots of brightly coloured pictures of flowers and bees and things like that, with a bit of some of the wonderful stories around them and some of the fantastic things that plants and pollinators are doing with and to each other in order to kind of explore this mutualism. Humans, of course, have messed with this system quite a lot over the years. So we've done a lot of selective breeding, and we've created these sorts of flowers which are almost kind of sexually stopped. So all of their reproductive organs have been pretty much bred out of them or hidden under layers of petals. So they're attractive perhaps, but not particularly great for your pollinators. We've also bred quite a lot of flowers to be tasty in different forms. So broccoli, cauliflowers, those sorts of things are basically flowers that we've bred to be, rather than opening up and having petals and producing nectar, to be kind of chunky vegetables. So humans have done quite a lot of messing around with this system, and more widely across the globe, we've moved plants from one habitat to another. We've introduced various diseases of both plants and pollinators in different parts, and we're doing lots of things to habitats, and I'll be talking about more of that later. But for now, let's explore pollination a bit more. So what is pollination? It's the transmission of pollen from the male flower parts, so the anthers which produce pollen, which is essentially like plant sperm, if you like, to the female part of the flower, so that's the stigma. And that's necessary in order to fertilize the ovules inside the flower and produce seeds. So for some plants, transferring that within the same flower is sufficient. So it can self-pollinate itself using pollen within the flower. But for other flowers, other plants, then you might have to transfer the pollen from one flower to another flower on the same plant, or another flower on a different plant. And there's some plants where it even needs to be transferred to a completely different variety in order for pollination to happen. So that's, for example, cocoa trees. You might have to plant two different varieties in the same plantation in order to allow both of them to successfully set fruit. So that's your pollination. And it's quite a complicated process. We often think that it's just a kind of mutualistic thing where the bee gets all the benefits in terms of nectar and pollen, so it gets food, and the flower benefits by getting this pollination service, and everything's happy and friendly. But if we think about it from the different parties' point of view, then it becomes a little bit more nefarious, perhaps. So your bee really wants to get the maximum reward for the smallest possible amount of effort. The plant, on the other hand, wants to get the maximum amount of pollination while giving away the smallest amount of pollen and nectar for the pollinator to eat, which means that they both want slightly different things out of this, and that can lead to conflict and some really cool strategies. Let's think a bit about some of the pollinators that we have in the UK. Normally, when you say pollination, people's mind immediately jumps to the honeybee. And that's one species within the UK. So we have Apis mellifera. If we travel to Asia, there's a few other species of Apis, Florea, dorsata, but there are a handful of species across the globe. These are all social bees. They live in colonies. So you get normally one queen who's mated, and then she lays eggs which develop either into drones, male bees. If they're unfertilized, or if they're fertilized, they can develop into worker bees or into young queens. And the workers in the hive might number between perhaps 20 and 80,000 in a typical hive. Food is stored, so nectar's collected, that's concentrated down into honey, and that means they can get through a rough patch in terms of weather and so on. So that's your honeybee. We need to not forget about the 270 odd other species of bee that we have in the UK, perhaps 25,000 species of bee that we have across the world, and all of the other flower visitors that we get. So hoverflies, musket flies, bee flies, butterflies, beetles, almost anything that can visit a flower probably fulfills at least an occasional pollination service. And across the whole of the UK, we've got about one species of honeybee, we've got about 25 species of bumblebee, and all of the other bees that we have in the UK essentially are solitary bees, so wild bees that live out there, and they carry out their entire reproductive cycle alone. That's an example of a bumblebee. So that's the garden bumblebee. You can tell that because she's got 2 yellow stripes on her thorax as opposed to just one that some of the other species do. And that's probably one of the biggest species that we have in the UK. A queen garden bumblebee could be in excess of an inch long sometimes, and has got hugely long proboscis. So she can visit really deep, long tubed flowers. We also have other little solitary bees. So this is a Hyleus, a yellow-faced bee that's probably just about 3 or 4 millimeters long. So if we put them contrasted side by side, that's approximately the size differential if we did them to scale. So we've got a huge range of sizes, and that's wonderful for the flowers out there because different flowers are better pollinated by some bees or other insects more than others. The most likely bumblebees you'll come across in the UK are these 7 species. We've got the buff-tailed bumblebee, and that's probably the commonest one. They'll have normally 2 generations a year, so they tend to be active from even as early as January, February some years, and often going right through till November. There's even some parts of the country, especially London, in fact, where they even have a winter generation, a 3rd generation. So they're very opportunistic and quite adaptable. They're really good at taking best advantage of changing conditions, and they use gardens and things very readily. The red-tailed bumblebee is more of a grassland species that you might find a little bit more commonly outside the most densely populated areas. Beautiful bees, and they're kind of more of a summer species, perhaps. Your common carder bee is one of the ones that goes latest into the year. So that's one of the last bees that you'll still see foraging on flowers and in gardens at this time of year. Then we've got the white-tailed bumblebee. I've put a male there because the females look almost identical to the buff-tailed bumblebee, but the males have got a nice yellow face and they're quite kind of teddy bear-like. They're rather sweet. That's your garden bumblebee again, and you can see that it's got a very horse-like face, kind of long pointed face, and that's quite distinctive. And your early bumblebee is another species that manages 2 generations a year, so they tend to start quite early in the spring, and they're kind of very cute little round little buzzing bees, and the males are quite kind of sort of party bees. They're quite brightly coloured. They sort of look like they're going for a night out perhaps. And then finally in this bottom right hand corner, that's the tree bumblebee. This is the one that's only arrived in the UK in perhaps the last 20 years. It particularly seems to like nesting in people's bird boxes. So unfortunately, people will put up a nice bird box for the blue tits and then notice a few months down the line that there haven't been any blue tits, but there seem to be quite a lot of these interesting orange and black and white bees coming and going. Because it likes those sorts of nesting sites, so it will nest in holes in trees and things like that above the ground, whereas most of the other species prefer to nest below the ground. Even though it's a new entrant into the UK, it hasn't had that sort of effect that some invasive species have, where they've pushed out all of the other species and come into competition. It seems to have sort of slotted into our ecology quite nicely and quite charmingly. So I'm rather fond of it. Those are all of our insect pollinators, and particularly our bee pollinators. Globally, there's also various vertebrate pollinators, so animals with a backbone, including birds, so hummingbirds in the neotropics and sunbirds in the paleotropics, places like South Africa. There are a few cases around the world of lizards being pollinators, because they'll quite happily stick their faces into flowers and drink nectar in some cases. And in many parts of the world, bats are really important pollinators. If you've ever heard somebody discussing durian fruit, that's that really stinky fruit that you get from Indonesia that smells terrible. It's quite a large thing. That's pollinated almost entirely by bats. So when we think about pollinators, we do need to think more widely than just focusing on honeybees, because all of these species have got habitat requirements and life cycle needs that go far beyond just stick in a hive and pollination sorted. So back to this idea that it's not just a completely mutualistic thing where everybody wins and there's no sort of tensions or conflicts at all. Sometimes it's more complicated than that. Because the plant needs to try and save as much energy as possible to put into its seeds, then it tries to make sure that only the best pollinators visit. A strategy that this tobacco flower has adopted is to try and limit short-tongued pollinators that are a bit messy and will tend to get pollen everywhere, and it'll instead hide its nectar further down this long tube. So its nectaries, the nectar producing organs, are somewhere around here. And so that means that only long-tongued species, so for example, a garden bumblebee, will be able to access that. So it limits its pollinators to species that are a little bit more efficient. And that's quite a common strategy, is to have these morphologies that make it difficult for the less efficient pollinators to visit. Of course, whatever you do to attract in a wide range of insects, there's always a risk that you'll also get pests and thieves. These blister beetles, they're fantastic looking, but they'll quite happily munch on the flowers, but they'll be attracted in by many of the same cues that pollinators will be using. So the plant has to be a little bit selective about who it's trying to get to visit. You can, as a plant, be generalist. So a flower like this scabious flower, can be used by a whole range of different insects. The nectar and the pollen are both easy to get to. And that means if you're that plant, you can always find somebody out there who's willing to visit, who's transferring a bit of your pollen. But those visits might be low quality, because that potential pollinator could be covered with daisy pollen, dandelion pollen, perhaps clover pollen, and they might deposit that all over you. And that clogs up your stigma with pollen that can't fertilize your ovules and cannot allow you to set seed, which is not really a strategy that you want at all. So it's a risk being generalized. You'll get lots of visits, but they may not always be the best ones. The other end of the spectrum, as a plant, you can go for a specialist strategy. So on the left is bee orchids. They really have only got one species or one or two species of insect that pollinate them. So these large wasps, and we don't even have them present in the UK. So bee orchids in the UK just don't get pollinated. They have to rely on self-pollination and on like asexual reproduction, perhaps via their roots and things like that. So that's quite a specialist strategy to have. And that means that when your pollinator does visit, they're pretty much guaranteed not to have anybody else's pollen on them. The only pollen on their body should hopefully be that which is useful to you. I wonder if anyone recognises the flower on the right-hand side of the screen. No, that's a cocoa flower. And cocoa is one of my favourite pollination systems. It's just a fantastic tree. The flowers come straight out the side of the trunk instead of being on twigs or anything like that. You literally get these little flowers straight out the side of a trunk at about head height, and it's pollinated by tiny midges, related relatively closely to the kind of ones where if you go camping in Scotland and you wake up one morning and you're absolutely covered in itchy bites, pretty much similar sorts of species are doing the pollination of cocoa all across the tropics. And they're very small, which means that they can get into the flower, they can get into those little hoods in that beautiful flower and contact the anthers and collect a little bit of pollen, collect a little bit of nectar, and then wipe it off on that stigma on the way out. And they seem to be our major cocoa pollinator. They're just fantastic to study because there's so little that we know about them. Nobody's really successfully bred them in large numbers in the lab, the same way we've been able to breed things like honeybees and bumblebees in captivity. So understanding what they need in order to thrive is really important because we all want to have more chocolate, but there's so many research gaps still to fill. Once we start to get into these tensions about the plant wanting to spend as little energy as possible on rewarding the pollinator, but still keeping their loyalty and getting those visits in, you start to get all kinds of cool strategies. This is a plant called Impatiens balsamifera, I think. It's related to Himalayan balsam and busy lizzie. So it's a similar sort of species to them. It's really sneaky because only about 1 in 3 of its flowers has nectar. Those flowers are rewarding enough that the bees that visit it will keep on visiting, but from the plant's point of view, it's able to cut down its expenditure on nectar by making some of its flowers cheating. So the bee keeps on visiting, but only gets rewarded some of the time. It's kind of playing nectar roulette or something. So that's quite a kind of cool, sneaky strategy. And this is relatively common across the plant world. This is a species called Lantana camara. It's invasive pretty much all across the warm regions of the world. And this also has adopted a strategy of only having some of its flowers containing nectar. But rather than just being sneaky and letting the bee guess at which ones those might be, it does actually give some clues. So the younger flowers, the pinker ones, have got nectar. Those are the ones that haven't been visited yet. And so the plant wants a bee to, or in fact a hummingbird, to visit those. The yellow flowers are the older ones. They've already been pollinated, so the plant doesn't really need more visits to those flowers, but it holds on to them anyway. And the advantage to the plant of this is that by hanging on to those old flowers, it's got a bigger display. And a lot of pollinators are quite short-sighted, so you want a big, bold display in order to attract their attention. But then once your bee, your butterfly, your hummingbird gets in closer, it can see this signal that's telling it, these are the flowers I'd like you to visit, the pink ones, they're delicious, these yellow ones I prefer you not to bother with so much, and so their nectar production will drop down. So it's a kind of honest signaling method, and I think that's rather marvelous. And there's a few different species that do that. There's a Japanese species, I think, that will even change its flowers back and forth in colour depending on whether it thinks it's had enough pollination or not. Here's another cool plant. So this one is called Solanum cowii. It's an Australian plant that's related to tomatoes and potatoes, and it's got both male and female flowers. But neither of its male or female flowers produce any nectar. And of course, pollen is the kind of male gamete, the male sexual stuff, if you like. So the female flower also produces no pollen. So if you've got no pollen and no nectar, how on earth are you going to get a pollinator to visit you? And they've devised this rather marvelous thing of producing fake pollen. So it doesn't have any like DNA in it that can be used to fertilize a seed, but it's got that same kind of outer coating and appearance and scent. So the pollinator visits thinking that it'll get the same stuff from the female flower as it will get from the male. And some orchids have even got kind of fake drawn on pollen, if you like, so kind of yellow markings on them that look like pollen. So quite a few plants do seem to have adopted this strategy of fake pollen, of fake pollen production. And yeah, back to the cocoa plant. Just a lovely picture there. Sex is a really good way to con your pollinator. And this can go through a few different strategies. So some of these flowers pictured are producing sex pheromones. So literally the same pheromone that the female wasp or fly or whatever would produce in order to attract males is coming out of that flower. So then the poor male wasp flies in, drawn by this amazing scent of this super female, starts mating with something that looks very much like a female, eventually realizes this isn't getting anywhere and gives up, only to go to the next plant and find another super female. And the great thing about this is the male has to keep responding to those pheromones because otherwise he'd never get any mating opportunities. So it's very difficult for him to evolve out of being tricked like this. The flower in the top right is taking a different strategy. That's Gaultheria from South Africa. Initially, they thought that this was pollinated perhaps by beetles because it looked a little bit like beetles sitting on the leaves, but they realize now that it's actually a species of fly. And that interesting kind of iridescent marks are the cues that the male fly uses in order to mate with females. So he flies in, and again, because it's a cue that's related to mating, he can never afford to stop responding to that. He always has to give it a go. So that's quite a cool strategy. And that means that the plant can get away with rewarding its pollinator really very little. You might not produce any nectar at all because they're coming in for what they think is a mating opportunity rather than a feeding opportunity. Another option that a plant can resort to is chemical warfare. And this can be quite useful if you're trying to pick your pollinator and filter out some rather than others. Rhododendron is invasive in many parts of the world. It particularly benefits from being pollinated by bumblebees. Honeybees are not such a great pollinator. So in many parts of its range, it produces guaianotoxin. So it's a particular toxin in its nectar. And this is, in most parts of the world, tolerated quite well by bumblebees, but will kill a lot of honeybees dead. Now, in most of its native range, the honeybees have evolved to be a bit more tolerant to this, but in invasive areas such as the UK, for example, if a UK honeybee visits rhododendron, it can become quite sick. So this means that the honeybees will tend to avoid visiting rhododendron in many parts of the world, but the bumblebees will get to move in there. And because they're bigger and fluffier and amazing, then they'll be much more effective pollinators, and the rhododendron wins and the bumblebees win. In the native range for the honeybees and the rhododendron, where they've overlapped historically, honeybees are able to tolerate this guaianotoxin, and they can make honey out of it. So you get this rhododendron honey that's got a low level of guanotoxin in. This doesn't just have toxicity to insects. This also has a low level toxicity to humans, and it can cause things like heart palpitations and disorientation. Rhododendron honey was probably one of the earliest examples of chemical warfare. So that's a picture of King Mithridates. He was obsessed with poisons. I believe that's where the concept of Mithridatism, where you dose yourself with like microdoses of poisons in order to build up resistance, came from. And he was a king in what's now kind of northern Turkey, I think, in about the 1st century BC. And he got wind that the Roman army was invading. He instructed his people to find honeybee colonies that had been feeding on rhododendron. So this mad honey that they produced would have been in the nest, and he got them to collect the honeycombs from those nests and leave them in the path of the invading Roman army. And the Roman army apparently, for some reason, went, "Cool, blimey, there's a whole load of honey in our path. This must be some sort of great gift to us. I know, I'll eat it," which they did. And then they all got groggy and sort of started presumably falling over and being disorientated. So once it had thoroughly set in, King Mithridates and his army moved in, defeated the army, and won the day. Another plant that produces cool toxins in its nectar is coffee. So just as it's got caffeine in its seeds in order to protect it against various herbivores that would try and munch on its seeds, caffeine is a mild insecticide. And so it's got caffeine throughout all of its plant parts, including some of it in its nectar. And we think that this might also aid in pollination, because caffeine in insects, just as the same as it does in humans, seems to make them a little bit smarter, help them form better memories, make them a little bit more motivated, perhaps. So we've been exploring this idea that perhaps caffeine in nectar is something that we can employ more widely in pollination. There's some cool work over the last 15 years or so showing that if you get a bee like this and you put it, so this is a honeybee, and you put it effectively in a straitjacket and you blow an odor over its antennae at the same time as giving it a little bit of sugar, after a while it starts to learn that that odor is associated with the sugar. And then it starts to respond to the odor even without the sugar. So it's a Pavlovian type thing. It'll start sticking its tongue out when it smells that odor, even without the sugar. And a researcher called Jerry Wright a few years ago discovered that if the bees had been fed caffeine during this training process, they remembered that odor for longer. So a normal bee would forget after 24 to 48 hours about the wonderful thing that this odor represents and stop responding. But caffeinated bees kept on responding. It was clear that the bees were forming this stronger memory association. And we thought, well, can we apply this in commercial settings, perhaps, to give us better crop pollinators? A paper that people that I worked with and me had out earlier this year did exactly that. So we got bumblebees, and in the nest we put some sugar solution with caffeine in, and also the odor of strawberry flowers. And the bees fed on this. They built up a kind of a memory association for this odor of strawberry flowers. Initially, we trialed this in the lab, so we let those bumblebees out and they had to tell the difference between some plastic robot flowers that either smelled like the strawberry flowers or smelled like a distractor, so linalool. It just kind of smells generically floral. And sure enough, the caffeinated bees made more choices that were correct, if you like. They were more likely to visit the strawberry flowers than they were to visit the distractor flowers. And then we went on to do some trials in these little polytunnel greenhouses to see whether that worked kind of in a real life situation. And it did seem to help the bees pollinate better, and it meant that the strawberries in those polytunnels were a little bit heavier and higher quality. So now we're looking at more research where we can understand a bit more about what caffeine is doing to bees' brains, how it makes them better, and what the potential benefits might be. And this is really important. See that box there, BioBest bumblebee pollination. UK fruit growers are spending millions of pounds a year buying in those boxes of bumblebees. So these are bumblebees that have been reared in warehouses in these boxes. They're shipped to the fruit growers, who then open the doors. The bees fly out and provide their pollination services. And this is because there just are not enough wild pollinators left in the environment to provide us with sufficient pollination on large-scale crops like strawberries across Kent. And so any additional efficiency gains that growers can get from those commercial bees will translate into more efficient strawberry production, and will mean that they'll be getting better bang for their buck, if you like. The other really good advantage is that commercial bees are kind of potentially exploiting some of the environment as well. If we're releasing commercial bees into those polytunnels, some of them might wander off and go and visit other things like wildflowers in the field margins and in the hedgerows, and that brings them into competition with our wild bees, and we'd rather not do that. So if we can form that bias within the commercial bees and make them more interested in the crop rather than wildflowers, that means they're better for the environment. It means there's more resources left in the rest of the world for the wild bees. And hopefully that's a more responsible way to employ and deploy these commercial pollinators. So that's kind of a cool area that I'm working on at the moment. But I've talked now quite a bit about all of the things that the plants are doing, but sometimes the pollinators fight back. Earlier we looked at that flower with a very long corolla, so a very long tube that the pollinator had to have a long tongue in order to reach down and be able to drink the nectar. Some pollinators decide that they just can't be bothered with that sort of nonsense, so they'll chew a hole at the base of the flower and drink the nectar from round the back, if you like. This queen bumblebee is doing it on red clover, and she, to be honest, probably could reach down the flower in order to access the nectar the legitimate way. She'd just rather go in the easy way, because why not? That's Salvia hot lips, and you can probably see there's holes chewed at the base of the flowers in both cases. So instead of having to go in the legitimate way and really stretch and reach to get to the nectar at the base, the bee can just kind of flick their tongue in just a little bit and get the nectar that way. So it's a lower effort way of doing it, and it's particularly beneficial if you're a relatively short-tongued bee. Here in the UK, probably the main culprit is the common buff-tailed bumblebee. Most of the other bumblebees in the UK are sort of a bit more mugs, if you like, and will tend to use the legitimate route. But once the buff-tails has chewed those holes in, everyone else starts to use them as well. So I've seen male bees do it. Now, male bees very rarely chew these holes on their own, but they're more than happy to use the holes that are made by the females. Honeybees will do it. I've seen solitary bees using holes that have been chewed by buff-tailed bumblebees. So once you're a plant and you've started being robbed, it starts to cascade into a bit of a complicated situation. And it's not great for the plant, because a bee that is bypassing all your reproductive organs is taking all of your nectar and not providing any pollination service. It's rubbish. So some of the plants have decided to fight back. And this is Aconitum napellum. It produces aconitine, so quite a nasty toxin that's in both the petals and also in the nectar. This can only be tolerated by certain species of long-tongued bee that are able to go in the legitimate way and don't mind if they encounter a bit of that in the nectar. Short-tongued bee species like the buff-tailed bumblebee, who try to rob around the back, they try to go in and chew that little hole, will get themselves a mouthful of aconitine, and that makes them quite unwell. So it discourages that nectar robbing by pretty much punishing the nectar robbers and just rewarding the legitimate visitors. Sneaky. So for the last bit of this talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about threats to pollinators, what we can do, and what sort of things we need to be thinking about in the future. There's lots of information in the news. Every few months now, there seems to be a new headline about insect apocalypses and pollinator declines, or what alternatives we might have if all the bees die. There's that terrible fake quote that was not from Einstein at all. That was something like, if the bee were to go extinct, humanity would follow within 3 years. Einstein never said that. And I'm not sure that that's strictly true, but I think we can all agree that pollination is important and that pollinators are under threat. And those are things that we do need to think about. And there's a lot of different things that are threatening pollinators. A big one is how we manage spaces with wildflowers in. About 98% of the UK's meadows have been destroyed over the past century or so. So the area of wildflowers that's left to bees and other pollinators is very, very small. And as people push for things like tidy road verges and so on, that tends to exacerbate the problem. Also, this tendency to favour kind of fancy ornamental versions of plants, that can't be used by a bee. It probably doesn't even produce nectar and the pollen's inaccessible. So it's not a helpful plant to have. Land use change is a big one. So the remaining meadows and natural areas that we do have are quite often being turned into something else, whether it's a different type of agriculture, a housing estate, or Tesco's. There's also threats from some of our managed pollinators. Bumblebees being brought into the country. In the past, they were non-native subspecies and they had all sorts of diseases. So they were going out spreading diseases to wild pollinators and also crossbreeding with them. So we were losing some of the UK's genetic diversity in our buff-tailed bumblebees. Honeybees as well. If you keep honeybees in an area where there isn't enough in the way of wildflowers, the honeybees are coming into conflict or competition with all of the wild pollinators. And in some areas like French cities and parts of London, this has been shown to be detrimental. So we do have to be quite responsible about how we use managed pollinators. Another knock-on effect can be the spread of diseases from those managed pollinators into wild bees. So this is a honeybee that's affected by varroa and has also been infected with probably deformed wing virus. So that used to be a disease that was exclusively a honeybee problem, but now it's turned up in bumblebees because of various problems with how commercial bees have been raised and deployed. And I think somebody has even detected it in hoverflies now. So it's spreading through the environment. And of course, one that turns up in the news fairly regularly is the use of pesticides, particularly insecticides, but also to some extent herbicides and fungicides. All of these tend to be chemicals that are formulated in order to interfere with living things and living cells. So it's inevitable that they'll have some consequences for pollinators. But if I had to name the biggest one of these, I would say land use change, and the way that we manage habitats is probably the biggest issue for pollinators. And that can manifest in things like people increasingly removing areas of grassland. So you start off with a flower-rich grassland, and that's wonderful for pollinators. Then it gets turned into a close-mown lawn, which has got almost no flowers on. So that's got very little biodiversity value. And then at the extreme end, people decide to get rid of the lawn entirely and replace it with astroturf, decking, or patio. So each time a little bit of that happens, gradually we're eroding what's left for our pollinators, and indeed what's left for all of the other organisms in the environment that are beneficial, whether it's parasitoid wasps that help to control caterpillars, whether it's ladybirds that help to control aphids, those sorts of things. What can we do as gardeners, as perhaps people with gardens, as people who are invested in our local green spaces? One option is to try and choose the plants that we put into our gardens a little bit more carefully. So rather than getting only the kind of fancy ornamental type varieties, have a look for simpler varieties that are closer to the wild relatives. And it doesn't have to be 100% of the plants in your garden, but perhaps look for one or two. And a lot of them in a lot of garden centres will bear this RHS plants for pollinators symbol on them. Actually, my recommendation sometimes is go into a garden centre on a nice sunny day, walk around the outside area and see what the bees within the garden centre area are visiting. Look at what plants seem to have bees and flies and things on them and choose some of them. That's worked for me quite well in the past. There's some work out of the University of Sussex that looked at various garden plants and watched them over several seasons to see which ones were receiving the most visits overall and which was receiving the most visits from kind of diverse species of bee. So not just about getting loads and loads of honeybees, but about perhaps attracting in some of the more interesting solitary bees, perhaps some of the rarer bumblebees, things like that. What they did find is that those pelargoniums, kind of red ones that you get in hanging baskets, pretty much useless. Likewise, a lot of petunias and some of those really fancy dahlias, not so great. Plants that work well for pollinators are often things like culinary herbs, so things like marjoram, lavender, rosemary, things like that. Some of the Mediterranean plants, so things like this lamb's ear, and also things that are actually quite similar in form to weeds and wildflowers often tend to be quite good. The best plants tend to be ones with kind of accessible nectar and accessible pollen in terms of attracting in a wide range of pollinators. Another thing that can be quite good is perhaps better rollout of no-mow May. Plant Life recommends that relaxing your mowing regimes on road verges and things is good, but we still need to keep sight lines clear. So there is a balance to be struck between traffic safety and wildflower provision, but that can be done if it's managed well, and you can add more plants into road verges as well. This one on the top left, I would say, is a better road verge than this one in the bottom right, because top left seems to be mostly native UK wildflowers. So those are species that have kind of co-evolved with the bees that we have in the UK and tend to be better resources. These ones here in the bottom right, they look like perhaps more American prairie plants. And so they're going to be perhaps less well suited to some of our rarer and more specialist bees. And this likewise, it's nice, it's great to have these sorts of no-mow areas, and that's definitely better than nothing. But again, to me, that looks more like prairie plants rather than like UK native wildflowers. So that's something that perhaps councils and land managers should be a little bit more sensitive to, is it just about more plants or is it about the right plants? So I could just kind of stick up a list of names of plant species that I recommend as things to stick in your garden, but I thought some photos might be nicer instead. These are some of the winners from my garden in early spring. The Aubritia in particular seem to be really good for things like bee flies, as opposed to just typical bumblebees and things. The flowering currant, that ornamental currant, always seems to be a good hit with some of the solitary bees. As we move from late spring into early summer, comfrey, geraniums and lamb's ear seem to be really good. When I say geraniums, the kind of like crane's bill type ones rather than the pelargonium type ones. And as we move into midsummer, I kind of manage my lawn as a bit of a wildflower meadow. So things like oxeye daisies and knapweed and yarrow really come into their own. So those kind of meadow plants, but also Viper's bugloss is an excellent plant. It looks fantastic. You do get a really long flowering season out of it, and so many different species of bee will make use of it at different points. That's a flower bee, I think it's Anthophora quadrimaculata. So you get an amazing range of stuff out of a different selection of plants. And here I'm kind of using both daisy family plants, but also like a borage family plant. So a few different plant families can be good. As you head towards the end of the season, those daisy family flowers really do come into their own. And some of them will keep flowering really late into the year. The other one that can be quite good as a wildflower, just to tolerate a bit in your garden, is black horehound. It's a really good goer, doesn't really take much looking after, and the bees in the late season really do appreciate it because it's got loads of nectar. It keeps on going, and it's got quite accessible nectar as well. So even the relatively short-tongued bee species can use it. That was kind of mostly a selection of things that perhaps would be regarded as wildflowers and weeds, but there's ornamental plants and kind of close relatives of many of those species that if you wanted something a bit prettier, you could choose instead, I suppose. So my top tips would be to think about the diversity and the continuity of nectar and pollen sources. So both having lots of different sorts of flowers that can be used by different pollinator species, so some with long tubes and some with short, but also the continuity. So have you got plants in flower right from, say, late February through to early November? Or are there bits of the year when not a lot in the way of flowers are going on? Because then if you're a pollinator active in that garden and suddenly there's nothing to eat, you're in trouble. I'd also suggest mowing less if you can on your lawn. So if you mow every week, is it possible to perhaps mow part of it every 2 weeks instead? Also think about how you deploy pesticides. So do you need to use them at all? Can you either switch to less damaging versions, so perhaps something like pyrethrum or one of the botanical type derived ones? Could you perhaps tolerate a little bit of damage on some of your plants? Because once you start to reduce your pesticide use, that provides a better environment for all of those excellent natural enemies of pests, ladybirds and lacewings and parasitoid wasps, and even social wasps will help tackle all of those caterpillar and aphid problems. So it kind of works overall. And also don't just think about food, think about nesting sites. Bee hotels, I could have a long discussion about them, but I'll just say they're great. They tend to favor common species over rare species, but they're a really nice thing to watch. Also, patches of bare soil, especially light soils that are south facing, can be really good nesting sites for some of those solitary bees. And a lot of those same principles we're applying in our research overseas. This is a Tanzanian bean field, and some of those same concepts are ones that we're promoting in the field margins. So the idea of a diversity of plants providing different resources for different organisms, and a continuity of flowering plants throughout the year, reducing the use of synthetic pesticides, and working with the farmers to see if they're able to cut those field margins less frequently. It can be a bit of a trade-off because if you're a smallholder farmer, you may need to cut some of those field margins to feed your animals, for example, but we're looking at what options are available, and that's a really rewarding project because I've learned so much along the way, and it's just some of the most beautiful places in the world. So I'll leave it there because I said about 45 minutes and I've overrun that slightly, but I'm happy to answer questions, talk about anything, talk more about bees, and I thank you all for listening.